Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Nozzleheads Extra Innings, where we're covering a few extra topics to supplement the videos we've already had here on our channel. This topic today is going to be talking a little bit about weed resistance. I'm Jared Rosskamp. I'm the BSF Tech Rep covering Illinois and Missouri. And with me today,
Brady Kapler, tech rep here in Nebraska.
So again, as I mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about weed resistance, not because people don't know it exists, but just to give a little insight on where we're at with the development of weed resistance and maybe a little bit more understanding on why weeds are resistant. So with that, Brady, why don't you give us a little update on where we're at with today's weed resistance spectrum as a whole and talk about what we're seeing?
Sure. One of the things that I use all the time and one of my favorite resources here for this is the website called weedscience.org. And Ian Hemp does a great job there of tracking what the current state of resistance is in the world. And so you go on his website and you pull it down and he's got different articles, but there's always this middle part that gives out kind of the daily stats of where we are, and it's an update of what that is. And so today it's reporting there's 512 unique cases of resistance on 266 species. And it's probably about 60-40 broadleaves versus grasses. But also reports that there is resistance to 21 of 31 modes of action or sites of action out there. And we're not getting any new sites of action or modes of action that are coming. So that's what we've got. And so it's kind of eye-opening when you look at that. And then, we've got weed resistance in. This is not just a Nebraska problem. It's not an Illinois problem. It's not a U.S. problem. Worldwide, there are 96 crops in 71 countries in which there are resistant weeds. So this is a worldwide problem that we're seeing as resistance to different herbicides out there.
Yeah, and I like to think of it this way, Brady. Being weed scientists' background and training for both of us here, you know, really weed resistance is something that is naturally occurring out there, right? Whether that's from a herbicide where the genes are genetically mixing, and what we do is how we get resistance through our fields prevalently is we're selecting for all the ones that are susceptible. So if you sprayed Roundup, for example, over and over and over again, you keep taking all the ones that are susceptible and leave the ones behind that are naturally mutants in the field that have that resistance gene in them. And this can happen to more than just herbicides too. There's old stories of red rice down there, which would be a weed in rice. And phenotypically, we used to go out and hand pull all the seed heads from the weeds because they look different from the rest of the rice in the field. And eventually we selected for those weeds that looked more like the rice. And so therefore, technically we have hand resistance. We have resistance to hand weeding to some level, right? So any form of weed control can have some level of quote unquote resistance or shift in the population to that method of control. So today we're specifically talking about herbicides, and nothing really new, but talking specifically about herbicides, let's talk a little bit about what are the key types of resistance that we're fighting.
Right. When we look at the types of resistance, and I think that's something the first common one that people are typically exposed to is going to be site mutation for types of resistance. And so they talk about that, and that's where we've got an altered site within the plant. And so where the herbicide normally binds, it changes that so it no longer is able to bind, and the herbicide is basically deactivated, and the plant shoves it off somewhere else and gets rid of it. And so it's kind of a plant defense mechanism that it has. And in some cases, that's been used as beneficial for developing herbicide crops, tolerant crops type of thing like that. But it's also the method that we see when we are having, weed resistance issues. So site mutation is the most common one. The one that's getting the most press rate lately, though, tends to be the metabolism-based one, where basically the plant figures out, or the weed figures out a way to metabolize that herbicide when it comes in and shove it off and get rid of it into the plant too. But it's not a binding issue. It's just a way that herbicide's coming in and the plant's actually deactivating it before it even gets to the binding site to face any type of binding site resistance. So the metabolism is quite fascinating. And the interesting thing is that also gives the weeds a pathway to develop multiple site resistance too as well. It's not they've got a binding to this one and a binding to this one. It's metabolizing that herbicide as soon as it comes in the plant, and it's having to deal with it that way and dealing with the herbicides that way. Back to kind of where we started with, and I thought this as you were saying it, weeds are not dumb. I mean, we often think, oh, it's just a plant and it can't move and everything else like that. But these things it's quite fascinating because their true survival depends on doing this. And so we may not want them. That plant is out of place, so it's a weed. We don't want it in the field, but its job is to produce seed and reproduce and keep its species alive. And so that they don't have a lot of the other distractions we humans have in the daily life. Their job's to keep their species alive.
And its adaptability is really amazing, right? I mean, that's what we get back to. And granted, we've got resistance in a lot of different species today. I mean, the one that comes to top of mind is water hemp, right? Or Palmer amaranth, depending on where you're at. Those amaranth species that outcross. There's some really key elements to some of these that make some resistant weeds more prolific and bad than others, right? Water hemp being that it makes a ton of seeds, it can cross with each other and trade that genetics back, and it grows in such a wide and emerges in such a wide window that we fight it with so many different chemistries at so many different times of the year, versus something like a velvet leaf or lamb's quarters, where we just don't see the resistance issues as near as much. So all in all, resistance, the topic as a whole, we tend to think of it on a few key weeds like our Palmer amaranth and our water hemp, because we've got more sites that it's resistant to, and frankly, we all seem to fight that one more frequently. So one that I think probably isn't getting enough press is our grass weeds that we continue to see developing resistance, or we're starting to see more incidences of that resistance here in the U.S.
Yeah, I think so. And, grasses are definitely on the rise. Broadleaves get all the press, but grasses are definitely on the rise. And, how do we, when we look at this and we think, how do we possibly preserve what we've got going on? Is this just a train wreck? We're going to end up there and everything else like that? No. And I think that's sometimes the thing is that once you get a herbicide that's got a resistance, it's like, oh, we got to throw that herbicide away. No, that herbicide still has utility. We have glyphosate resistant weeds, but glyphosate is still a very useful herbicide. So we've just got to learn how to use it. And it's, a change in spectrum for it, but it's not a change in that it has no value. It just doesn't have value in controlling that. And they're still susceptible ones, species typically in the field of that same species. So we'd use that. Obviously, the first thing we hear a lot of is using multiple modes of action. And, I think first early on, we used to talk a lot more about rotating modes of action. And I think the research has kind of shown a little bit more that we see benefits in tank mixing and adding multiple modes of action versus, like I just said, pulling something out and saying, okay, let's go a different direction and don't expose it to that one anymore or whatever type of thing. No, let's go ahead and get weed control there, but let's use a different mode of action for that. And then, of course, the things like layering residuals. We've learned that for dealing with tough things like Palmer, we've got to layer and have constant, type residual activity to keep these, because the easiest to control weeds is, as we say, the unemerged weed only has one growing point. So it definitely makes it that. And then we've got to be proactive in our things like the post applications and making sure we're controlling weeds when they're small and actively growing. We can't be trying to get 12-inch tall weeds. We'll always have some escapes in areas where we have, situations with big weeds, but we've got to limit that as much as possible.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the most challenging things, Brady, is that when we start to see or fight resistant weed species in our fields, it's typically not just overnight flip a switch whole farm, right? And even where we have been fighting for a long time, keeping a mindset of reducing that weed set and reducing those escapes is a long-term goal toward better success in limiting how much spread of these resistant weeds, and it actually makes us overall more effective. If I think about, shatter cane back in the day, you go cut the heads off to keep that seed from resetting. That was a true way of helping manage some of the weed resistance we had, and we really don't see the same level of issues, even though they're out there, of shatter cane that we used to, because of some of these tactics. So as I think about all the things you said there, that is a great way to manage the herbicide portion of the business. But back to the limiting escapes, we need to think about all the cultural and mechanical practices we can use. And also, starting on a field by field level, I think, don't see this as a task that is so insurmountable if you're trying to manage weeds that you've had train wrecks with. These are things that you can manage on a field by field basis, sometimes starting just with managing your field edges or areas where we have really high pressure. And by taking little steps with these same key tactics, weed management can still be attainable where we have resistance. And, unfortunately, we're probably not going to have the herbicides to rely on forever. So we need to integrate our thought process and how we approach these weed resistant issues, because they're not going away.
You're exactly right. And I think, it's like you said, start small, think in an area you can manage and something you can do. What is your worst field? Can I go to that, and what can I start doing to manage weeds? Can I Can I take the four-wheeler around and get the edges of the field type of thing like that and control some of the weeds that are there? Maybe I don't have a problem in a field. Maybe I could actually look at some of my clean fields and say, okay, what's coming in from the edges or the waterways or whatever? Can I control that? The other thing is like we don't get enough press to the combine at the end of the year is a great distributor of weed seed. We know that. But we don't always think about, okay, do I need to clean that combine out before I leave the field? I understand it takes time. And, when people are harvesting, they don't always have that time. But even if you start, again, starting small, can I clean it on my worst field? Can I make sure we clean out the combine when we leave that worst field? Because we've got palmers so bad in this field, we don't need to take it to other fields type of thing like that. And so I think, again, baby steps, but you can get there with what you need to do. And then, of course, we talk about alternatives. We have some cultural methods, whether it's planting date adjustment, different things like that for dealing with weed species. Mechanical is still very much alive in that thing. And I know we have some great no-tillers out there too that kind of cringe when we talk about mechanical, but there's some different things out there that still exist that you can incorporate in some of your work fields. Again, you don't have to go out and, perhaps flame all your fields. That may not be the best, but maybe you've got an area where that's a viable tactic or something else along those lines. And so, or you cultivate those fields and just, a good old steel cultivator going through the field can make a big difference, but we know it might not get all the ones in the row and stuff. So it's an integrated approach that requires it to get there.
Yeah, and utilizing all the tools where you can see fit. And again, I think in conclusion here, to kind of think about weed resistance, the way we approach weeds today is a lot with herbicides. That's the easy button. They're very effective. I think it is on us in the field and in the industry to try and manage this and be good stewards of the chemistry we have. That way, that easy button's there for as long as possible, right? Weed resistance isn't going away, but yet to some level it can be managed with these tactics and tools. It's all up to us on how we do that. So in conclusion today, I guess my take home is try and be good stewards with the herbicides we have, utilize a good program, utilize multiple sites of action, and overall we can have success on combating these weeds as we move forward. So with that, thanks for watching today. So subscribe and like below for the Nozzleheads.